All right, folks, today we are joined by Dr. John Nowak from the USDA Forest Service. Dr. Nowak is an entomologist with the Southern Region's Forest Health Protection Team. Today he will discuss the biology, identification, ecology, and management of the southern pine beetle. This webinar is designed to help woodland owners, foresters, tree care professionals, researchers, natural resource managers, and concerned citizens learn about the southern pine beetle and other native bark beetles and how we can use this knowledge to help improve the health of our forests. The title of Dr. Nowak's webinar is Southern Pine Beetle Biology, Identification, and Management. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Nowak.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate the introduction and also the opportunity to talk with everybody today. Hope everyone's doing well. As Dave mentioned, I'm going to be talking about southern pine beetle, but I'm also going to touch on a few other southern pine bark beetles, the Ips engraver beetles, and black turpentine beetle. And just as a way of introduction, I work for the U.S. Forest Service, Forest Health Protection, and I'm located in Asheville, North Carolina. And I think this is a fairly timely webinar because at the end of 2016, there were a fair amount of southern pine bark beetle infestations across the South and even up into New Jersey and Long Island. As you can see from this map here, the red dots here are where southern pine beetle activity was reported at the end of 2016. The blue dots are where Ips beetle activity was reported at the end of the year, and where we're kind of paying close attention to as 2017 the field season starts up. This is where we want to kind of pay extra close attention to southern pine beetle and Ips both. Most of the significant southern pine beetle activity occurred in southwestern Mississippi and central Mississippi on the National Forest of Mississippi. Also, there was some notable southern pine beetle infestations in northern Florida and southern Georgia. And then, like I mentioned, all the way up in New Jersey, and even for the first time ever, some southern pine beetle activity in Long Island, New York. There's also some notable Ips activity in central Georgia on the Ecology National Forest and some private land near that national forest. And then in eastern Alabama and parts of Arkansas. Now, Ips beetles are oftentimes associated with, we consider them to be a secondary pest and often associated with some other type of stressor such as drought. And these areas in Georgia and Alabama, as people that live there probably know, have been suffering from some fairly severe drought over the past couple of years. So it's not surprising that there would be some Ips beetle activity in that area as well. However, there were a lot of dots on that last map. But before we go any further, I kind of want to put the level of activity somewhat into a historical context. Over the past 15 years, southern pine beetle populations, at least in the southern United States, have been at a fairly low level, particularly when compared to the mid-1980s and the mid-1970s, where really the whole South experienced huge outbreaks of southern pine beetle. Over the past 15 years, we've really seen fairly low levels. That doesn't mean that southern pine beetle has gone away or that we're not due for another large outbreak. It just means that population levels have been somewhat low for the past 10 to 15 years, and that's important to keep in mind for what you're seeing out there on the landscape now. I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about identification of these different bark beetles because it's important to know which insect species you're dealing with from a management perspective. You're not going to manage southern pine beetle the same way that you would manage Ips. There's some fairly effective methods for managing southern pine beetle, and there's some not really a ton of options for Ips beetles or black turpentine beetles. So it's important to know which insect you're dealing with right up front. On the left-hand side of the PowerPoint slide, in this person's hand here, you see the southern pine beetle. It's smaller than a grain of rice. On the right-hand side is a black turpentine beetle. That's about the same size as a grain of rice. They look similar to each other, a little different in size. I'll talk more about the way they look here in a second, but it's important to know which insect species you're dealing with. This picture shows all the different southern pine bark beetles that we have here in the south. The black turpentine beetle up on the top left, southern pine beetle down here on the bottom left, and then the Ips engraver beetles over here on the right. Now you notice that the black turpentine beetle looks fairly similar to the southern pine beetle, but as you saw on that previous slide, there's just a fairly big difference in their size between the two. These are somewhat difficult to identify unless you've looked at quite a bit of them, or you have a hand lens, or you can take them back to the lab and look at them under a microscope. The Ips engraver beetles, are also important southern pine bark beetles. They have these spines on the back end of them, and the back end is kind of cut out, whereas like with the black turpentine beetle, you kind of have this smooth back end. But the Ips engraver beetles have these 4 spines, the 5-spined Ips, and the 6-spined Ips. And again, if you haven't seen these before, or you don't have a hand lens to kind of look down, it might be difficult to identify them in the field. But if you've looked at a few of them, you can kind of see that even with the naked eye. Another very good way to identify if you have southern pine beetle, like on the left-hand side of the screen, versus Ips beetles, like on the right-hand side of the screen, is either through an aerial view of the tree mortality, or by walking around in the stand. You may be able to see if you have a cluster or a group of trees killed, or like on the right-hand side, you have a scattered pattern to your tree mortality. Southern pine beetle tend to kill groups of trees, or what we call southern pine beetle spots. You'll hear me refer to spots quite a bit during today's talk, and I'll talk more about that here in a minute. Whereas with Ips beetles, they're a secondary pest, so they're attacking the weakened trees, trees that are stressed by some other factors such as drought, and they generally don't attack a stand or cause damage in a large spot like southern pine beetle do, even though there are exceptions to that. For instance, right now in the Ecology National Forest in Georgia, Ips avulsus, the 4-spined Ips, is causing quite a bit of damage, and there are large groups of trees being killed. But generally, Ips and black turpentine beetle will kill scattered trees throughout a stand. I want to spend a little time talking about what a southern pine beetle spot looks like and how you would evaluate, if you were out there marking the southern pine beetle spot, the different types of trees that we talk about in a southern pine beetle spot. At the back of the spot are the trees that were killed the first. Generally, a southern pine beetle spot will start when a single tree or a group of trees gets hit by lightning, and the beetles will come into that tree, and then the spot will grow from there. These trees are likely vacated already. The beetles have gone through their whole life cycle and emerged and attacked the adjacent trees. As you move through the spot, these trees up here are most likely still have active beetles in there. The trees up here at the front are yellow faders, what we call them. They're still infested, and then there are likely green infested trees out here at the front of the spot. Southern pine beetle have a fairly well-developed chemical communication system, a pheromone system that helps them communicate with each other and overcome the tree's defenses, and that's why you see these spots occurring and progressing like I just described. from one area out to what we call the head of the spot, where you see these green or the yellow faders. And so that's important to think about the pheromone communication system and how that spot grows when we're talking about southern pine beetle suppression, stopping a spot, or southern pine beetle preventing a southern pine beetle spot from occurring or from growing. Another way to identify whether or not you have southern pine beetle or Ips engraver beetles or black turpentine beetle is by looking at these pitch tubes on the outside of trees that are attacked. These pitch tubes are formed when the beetles are boring into the trees, and this is the tree's attempt to pitch that beetle out or stop that beetle from getting in. And if there aren't that many beetles, the tree can overcome the beetle attack. If there are a ton of beetles, 500 or 1,000 beetles attacking at once, the tree is likely doomed. Southern pine beetle tend to go through the bark crevices, as you can kind of see here. And this may be a little more art than science, really, but if you see enough of this, you can kind of tell the difference. The southern pine beetle go through the bark crevices, whereas your Ips beetles will attack right on the bark plate and bore through that bark plate. The black turpentine beetle pitch tubes are really the easiest to identify. They're usually in the bottom 8 feet of the tree, so from like about head high down to the base of the tree is where you'll see black turpentine beetle pitch tubes, and they're the largest. They're by far the largest of the pitch tubes, much larger than southern pine beetle or Ips. Probably the easiest way to identify whether or not you have southern pine beetle versus Ips or black turpentine beetle is if you can peel back some of the bark from a tree that's been attacked and look at the gallery patterns made underneath the bark by the different beetles. Southern pine beetle make this S-shaped gallery or a serpentine gallery under the bark, and it's usually packed with frass. The Ips engraver beetles make what we call an H-shaped or a Y-shaped gallery under the bark, and right here where I'm pointing to is what we call the nuptial chamber. The male beetle attacks first in the case of Ips engraver beetles, and then the female beetles come in, and then each female will run off on these different galleries laying her eggs. And the number of females will kind of determine the shape of the gallery. Nonetheless, you can see that there's a big difference between the Ips engraver beetle gallery versus this S-shaped pattern from southern pine beetle. Black turpentine beetle tend to make a large feeding gallery, larval gallery, and then the larvae feed like in a big area underneath of the bark. So very different pattern than both the Ips engraver beetles and the southern pine beetle. I spent a number of slides on that because I think it's really important to identify which insect that you're dealing with, because as I mentioned before, it's going to determine what type of management you want to do. If you're dealing with southern pine beetle, it's going to be different than Ips beetle. So for the next several slides, I'm going to talk about some control measures associated with southern pine beetle. These same control measures do not relate to Ips beetles or to black turpentine beetle, however. These only relate to southern pine beetle. I'm not going to talk about these last two here, cut, pile, and burn, and cut and spray, because they're really not used very often. We traditionally mostly just use cut and remove and cut and leave. Cut and remove is exactly as it sounds. You're going in and cutting down the infested trees in an adjacent green uninfested tree buffer, and you're removing those trees from the site. The objective of this cut and remove is to reduce the beetle population and also to halt the spot expansion. So this diagram kind of shows what you would do if you were out there in a stand and marking a southern pine beetle spot for cut and remove. The back half of that stand or the spot here is the red trees that have already been vacated. The southern pine beetle adults have already come out of these trees, and you will notice that the tree needles are brown or red or falling off. Oftentimes the bark from these trees are falling off, sloughing off, and there's no reason to cut these trees down. In fact, we generally ask folks to leave those trees there because there are some natural enemies in those trees that will emerge and hopefully help to reduce the southern pine beetle population later on down the line. The green infested or the yellow fader trees are the ones that we want to be cut down and removed, in addition to that buffer strip out here in the front of uninfested trees that I discussed before. And generally what we say is you want this buffer strip to be about the length of your average height of trees. So if you're dealing with a 70-foot tall tree, you want your buffer strip to be 70 feet across. And if you have a spot that's growing very quickly, you have a lot of green infested trees, you may want to make that buffer strip even larger, depending on your situation. And after you do your cut and remove, you want to come back and look at that spot maybe 2 weeks later or 1 week later to see if there are any breakouts like what we have here, and you want to get those trees out of the stand as well. So there is some follow-up associated with cut and remove. Advantages to cut and remove are you reduce the beetle population, you're getting some return on your investment if someone will buy the timber, and also I think a fairly important part of this is you're clearing the site, thinking about what you need to do to regenerate that stand or that spot. Disadvantages, it requires you to have access. If there's no road right next to your spot, you may not be able to get heavy equipment into the area to do the cut and remove. Also, you need to have someone buy that spot. And oftentimes what happens is the market becomes flooded with beetle-killed timber and nobody wants to purchase it. They're not interested, and so you may not get a buyer. Also, you need to be fairly quick about it before the spot gets too large. Southern pine beetle, another control measure for southern pine beetle is cut and leave. And again, it's exactly as it says. You want to fell your green infested trees, your yellow infested trees, and a buffer here. This picture doesn't depict it very well, but you do want to cut a buffer and fell them back into the spot. Hopefully this will disrupt the pheromone biology. The beetles won't be able to identify the pheromone source, and it halts spot expansion. Both cut and remove and cut and leave are very effective in stopping individual southern pine beetle spots from growing. Advantages to cut and leave are that if you don't have access to that site, you could get in there maybe with a hand crew or smaller equipment and get that spot cut down. It's fairly inexpensive, and you can do it fairly quickly if you can find the spots and get in there and you have the crews to do it. Disadvantages are you're leaving the beetles out there, you're not getting any revenue, you're not clearing that site for regeneration purposes, and it's really not suitable for larger spots. Once you get more than 100 trees or so, you may need to either resort to cut and remove, or you may not be able to do much at all. So southern pine beetle spot control priorities, if possible and the population level is not too high, you want to get in there and remove all those SPB spots that you can. However, that's generally not the case, and you need to prioritize which spots you're dealing with. So we always recommend that you go and get the hottest spots first, the ones that have a lot of the green infested trees. The green to red ratio is fairly high, so you have a lot of green infested trees. We call that a hot spot, and we recommend that you get in there and treat those spots as quick as you can. Spots that are threatening other property resources, for instance, If you're managing on a national forest and a spot is near private land, that may be a spot that you'd want to address quickly. Also, if you are dealing with spots near like a red cockaded woodpecker habitat or some other endangered species habitat, you may want to address those spots quickly. And then local decisions based on your objectives and priorities, you may have other priorities determine which spots you get to first. So what about control of Ips and black turpentine beetle? Unlike with southern pine beetle, the control measures are somewhat limited. We often do not implement control of Ips and black turpentine beetle. Usually we recommend removal of infested trees only on a very limited basis. For instance, if you had some yard trees with black turpentine beetle in them, some of those trees were infested and some were not, you may consider going in there and removing the infested trees in hopes of saving your uninfested trees. However, if you're in a forest situation, this may be difficult or not really practical. If you have too much loss in your stand or it's too great, you get 10%, 15%, 20% of loss in your stand with Ips beetles, you may consider liquidating that stand depending on market conditions and the product class that you have and what your objectives are. But those are all kind of local decisions and individual decisions that a forester or the landowner need to make kind of jointly. And then with Ips beetles and black turpentine beetle, they're secondary pests, remember. They're associated with stressors on the landscape, drought particularly. Hope for rain is one thing that unfortunately is one of the things that we can say about Ips and black turpentine beetle. I always encourage folks, if they're dealing with Ips or black turpentine beetles, to consult their state forestry agencies, their county foresters, their district foresters. The Cooperative Extension Service is a good source. And then if you have a good relationship with a consulting forester, these are good people to ask questions, talk about suppression, talk about what types of insects that you have, those kind of things to meet your objectives. And we at the U.S. Forest Service, Forest Health Protection, we also indirectly work with landowners, usually through our state partners, to provide some technical assistance. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and shift gears just a little bit here and move from talking about southern pine beetle suppression to talking about southern pine beetle prevention, preventing outbreaks from occurring or trying to mitigate potential future losses from this insect. This is a program that I've managed since 2003. The program is only in the southern United States, so from Virginia to Florida over to Texas, those 13 states in the South. This program was started at the request of Congress in 2003. It's administered by Forest Health Protection, but it's implemented by our 12 national forests and 13 state partners. The basic tenet of this program is just increasing forest resiliency through good forest management. Forestry 101 type stuff. Then when it's appropriate or biologically timed to do so, if prescribed fire is called for, consider using it and restoring native pine forests, particularly longleaf pine, which is less susceptible to southern pine beetle than shortleaf pine and loblolly pine. Our state, private, and national forest partners have treated about 1.2 million acres over the past 14 years, and more than 15,000 landowners and loggers have directly benefited from the state-run cost share programs. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about what I would consider to be low hazard conditions for southern pine beetle. And this is the same whether or not you're talking about a shortleaf pine stand up here on the top left or a longleaf pine stand in northern Florida. The shortleaf pine stand is in Arkansas. The longleaf pine stand is in northern Florida. And the same will be true if you're dealing with shortleaf pine and in the mountains of North Carolina, or the pine barrens in New Jersey or Long Island. These same kind of conditions are what I would consider to be low hazard conditions for southern pine beetle. You have the right tree species on the site. Low intensity fire is part of the equation. And as you notice, there's a fairly low stand density in these two stands with not very much understory competition. This map is a screenshot of something I call the Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Story Map. And if you want to know more about the Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Program or what is available in your individual state, you can Google SPB Prevention Story Map and get this map and the other tabs here and see where the treatments have been done on the landscape, get more information about your state program or the program in general. This just shows you that different states had different tactics. Not each state got to kind of choose their own way of implementing the SPB prevention program. So Arkansas, Texas, Mississippi all chose to do a lot of first thinning through their cost share programs. States like Virginia and North Carolina did a lot more pre-commercial thinning, and you can kind of see that when you look at this map or zoom in and get more local data. If you look at those dots on an acre basis in this pie chart, you see that most of our work was done either in pre-commercial thinning or first thinning. So about 60% of the acres are in the thinning category, and we really push thinning as part of this program because I think it's the most biologically important aspect of a SPB prevention program. Prescribed fire is also part of the program, but a more limited basis. And then regeneration, particularly regenerating longleaf where it's appropriate. So are we certain that thinning prevents southern pine beetle? And the answer to this to me, is undoubtedly yes. We know that thinning does reduce the potential impact of southern pine beetle. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the foundational studies that give me confidence in saying that. Back in the late 1970s or early 80s, Evan Nebeker and John Hodges did a lot of work on this issue where they were artificially introducing southern pine beetle into stands with different basal area or different densities. They'd follow the spot expansion for 4 months, and their basic findings were that at about 80 square feet of basal area per acre, you were very unlikely to have spot expansion in those stands. As your density increases, the likelihood of spot expansion greatly increased as well. There were a lot of other studies and about thinning in southern pine beetle between 1980 and 2015, but this was one study that I was involved in. There was a southern pine beetle outbreak on the National Forest of Mississippi in 2012, and we went down there and looked at where the southern pine beetle spots occurred on the landscape. And we looked at unthinned stands versus thinned stands. And basically, out of more than 900 spots, only 2 of those spots occurred in recently thinned stands, so stands that have been thinned in the past 5 or 6 years. Only 2 of those spots occurred in those thinned stands. So why does thinning prevent southern pine beetle? Well, when I was in forestry school, we talked quite a bit about individual tree vigor. So the faster growing trees had more pitch to create these pitch tubes and potentially defend themselves from bark beetles. So it was all about the individual tree response to attacking beetles. And so what happens when you thin a stand? Your residual trees have more growing space, more light availability, so they put on foliage, more roots, live crown ratio gets bigger, and we suspect or we know that those trees with that are growing more vigorously have more potential to produce resin and protect themselves. However, as you may imagine, after the thin occurs, this takes 1 to 2 years for these trees to really adequately respond to this new growing space. So we used to say that you probably should not thin during an active southern pine beetle outbreak because the trees are going to take time to respond and it's going to be a delayed response. However, there's some other studies out there that kind of have me changing my mind about this. And maybe with southern pine beetle, maybe it is okay to think about thinning even during an SPB outbreak. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about some studies that have occurred that have kind of changed my mind and others' minds about this. In 1968, Guerra and Koster did this study where they had infested trees in the center of their plots, and then they looked at adjacent trees 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet, all the way up to 25 feet out. So the adjacent trees were spaced at greater distances from the infested tree. And what they found was that at the 5, the 10, and the 15-foot radius, the adjacent trees were all attacked after the center tree was attacked. However, once they reached the 20-foot radius and the 25-foot radius, those adjacent trees were no longer attacked. So they concluded that somewhere between 15 and 20 feet was kind of a magic number where the southern pine beetle didn't move from the initially attacked tree out to the adjacent trees. Jack Koster followed this work up in an outbreak in Louisiana and Texas. And what he found is that the probability of attack of adjacent trees from the initially attacked trees dropped off dramatically, particularly when you got to around the 5-meter mark, or about 18 to 20 feet. So again, that 18 to 20 foot distance may be an important distance between the initially attacked trees and the adjacent trees. They did some work in some areas with very high levels of SBB at a similar curve, but not as sharp. Again, though, as the distance between trees increased, the probability of attack decreased somewhat. But when you have really high levels of southern pine beetle, there's a lot of sources of the pheromone out in the forest. Some of these things start to break down somewhat. The reason I bring this up a lot is that in the South we do a lot of row thinning, a lot of 4th and 5th row thinning. And I think that from a southern pine beetle perspective, this is different than doing a thin by spacing because of the distance between your trees. We have seen in several cases where southern pine beetle will get into these stands that have been thinned with a row thinning, and the beetles will move straight down the rows. They won't jump across the row, but they'll move straight down the row where your spacing is still fairly tight, even though basal area in these stands are probably decently similar. So I've encouraged folks to think about thinning by spacing when you're talking about thinning for southern pine beetle. Another set of studies that kind of have changed my way of thinking about more about the microclimate or stand structure versus individual tree vigor as far as why thinning works, is some work done by Harold Thistle and Brian Strom, where they looked at a tracer gas kind of as a pheromone plume surrogate in different stand conditions. And they put these sensors up and throughout a forest, and then they thinned the stand down and watched how that tracer gas moved through the different stand densities. This is a basal area 140. Look at that canopy versus a basal area 70. Big difference there right after the thin. And again, they looked at how this tracer gas, or in this case a pheromone plume surrogate, moved through those different densities. And they concluded, or what they found was, that in the more dense forest, the more understory competition, that pheromone tended to just kind of sit in that stand. So it would be easy for the attacking beetles to identify the source of that pheromone. However, in the more thin stands where they had opened it up, understory competition was mostly gone. There was a drastic difference in the amount of sunlight that hit the ground, causing thermal updrafts, a lot more wind flowing through this stand, which helped to kind of push that pheromone out of there and disperse the pheromone, making it much more difficult for attacking beetles to identify the source and be able to coalesce on one individual tree or a group of trees. So with all these studies in mind, my thinning recommendations and the recommendations from the SPB prevention program, thinning certainly will prevent southern pine beetle. It's a valuable tool when thinking about SPB. Consider thinning by spacing. Consider that 20-foot distance between trees after your thinning has occurred, or as far out as you can, depending on your situation and your target basal area. And think about creating that open understory. A great way to create that open understory is through prescribed fire. So does prescribed fire or prescribed burning prevent southern pine beetle? And this is somewhat of a controversial subject, but we've always allowed it underneath of the southern pine beetle prevention program, even at a limited basis. It can be used to reduce competing vegetation, reducing the stress, and changing that stand structure, changing that microenvironment to a stand that pheromone plume would be more likely to blow out of if a bark beetle infestation started in that stand. Low intensity fire is part of these pine ecosystems, particularly shortleaf, longleaf pine ecosystems. However, we always talk about using caution when using prescribed fire for bark beetle prevention, particularly because if your fire gets too hot, you can cause some stress to the roots and maybe make those trees more susceptible to either southern pine beetle or to Ips beetles. So if you look at these two stands here, basal area may be similar between the stand on the left and the stand on the right. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but they may be similar. But if you think about that pheromone plume sitting in this stand, it's more likely to disperse out of this stand versus the stand on the right-hand side, where I would predict with all this understory competition that you would likely see the pheromone plume just kind of sitting in there. One study that somewhat contradicts or does contradict what I've been saying about prescribed fire and southern pine beetle is this study by Scott Cameron and Ron Billings that was done in Texas in the late 80s, where they looked at where the southern pine beetle spots occurred on the landscape. And what they found was that prescribed fire, southern pine beetle spots occurred in the stands that had been burned in the past more frequently than stands that had not been burned. I will point out that the stands that they looked at were between 8 years old and 15 years old, and I would argue that a prescribed fire in an 8-year-old stand or a 13-year-old stand is very different than a 25-year-old stand. And the reason I say that is we did a similar study in Mississippi, the study that I talked about before with the thinning and the 900 spots. We also looked at stands that had been burned and the amount of southern pine beetle that had occurred in there. And the stands that had been burned were less likely to have southern pine beetle, exactly the opposite of what Cameron and Billings found. We also saw that stands that had been burned recently, burned in the past 2 years, were less likely to have southern pine beetle. Additionally, stands that had been burned 2 or more times in the past 6 years had less southern pine beetle than stands that had not been burned. So stands that have been burned at all, burned more recently, or burned more often had less southern pine beetle in this particular study. There's probably opportunity for doing more research in this area, but I think it does fit kind of with what the what we're seeing from like the Harold Thistle study, more open stand, less southern pine beetle. One big difference between the stands that were burned versus unburned and did or didn't have southern pine beetle was the amount of hardwood competition. The stands that had been burned and didn't have any SPB had much less hardwood basal area than stands that had not been burned. And that's not rocket science, but it's just something to pay attention to, and I think it kind of fits with the argument that these more open stands would tend to have less southern pine beetle. So should you thin or burn during an outbreak? The answer to this question has mostly always been no. We've encouraged folks to maybe delay their thinning or their burning during an active SPB outbreak or during a lot of IPS activity. My mind on this is starting to change in that potentially with southern pine beetle, because you're changing that stand structure right away, you may want to consider thinning even during an active outbreak. My mind on when you're talking about IPS beetles or black turpentine beetle, I would stick to you probably want to delay that thin or burn, because remember, IPS beetles are attacking those stress trees, and you don't want to stress those trees out more or cause more stress in your stands during the thin or burn. So again, southern pine beetle, maybe you could get away with thinning, but with IPS beetles, you probably want to delay that. Again, there's not a lot of data on this topic, but there is some growing amount of data to somewhat back up that discussion point. One is an anecdotal case from Mississippi. When we were doing that study, we walked into this stand across the creek over here. It had been thinned that year during the SPB outbreak, and it was thinned right up to a creek where they couldn't get their heavy equipment across. On the other side of the creek was a beetle spot that moved right down to the creek. The beetles could have easily crossed the creek into the thinned area, but they just didn't, even though that stand had been thinned that year. Another study that kind of backs this up is one that was done by Jose Negron with mountain pine beetle and ponderosa pine. They looked at thin stands that had all been thinned in the past 2 years. There was a lot of mountain pine beetle pressure, and in the unthinned stands, they had almost 90 trees per acre killed versus in the thinned stand about 3 trees per acre. So big difference, even though the stands have been thinned fairly recently. And they concluded that the trees really didn't have time to respond to the thinning. They didn't have time to put on new foliage and be able to produce resin at a greater rate. So they really thought that the change was really associated with that change in stand structure or microclimate environment. So what about fire and bark beetles? Several studies have shown that there is a short-term increase in bark beetle activity. None of these studies dealt with southern pine beetle following a prescribed burn. So right after the prescribed burn, say the first year, these stands tended to have somewhat more bark beetle activity. The study that we did in Mississippi, as I talked about before, a lot of that burning had been done in the previous 2 years, and there were less southern pine beetle in those stands that had been prescribed burned. We've always recommended delaying the thinning or burning during IPS activity, like I mentioned before, and I think that would still be the case. With southern pine beetle, I think there's an opportunity, both with southern pine beetle and IPS, I think there's an opportunity to do more research in that area, however. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you again to Dave for inviting me to speak, and I hope to try to entertain any questions that y'all may have.
All right, thanks, John. I appreciate it. Excuse me, we had several questions come in, so let's jump right into those, shall we? We had a couple early on about which pine species were most affected, and that was we talked about a little bit in the chat room, but maybe you could go over it with us so everyone can hear about the relative susceptibility of the different southern pine species.
Great question. We consider shortleaf, loblolly, and Virginia pine to be the most susceptible. Slash pine and longleaf are less susceptible, although any of the southern yellow pines can be attacked. Eastern white pine is not a primary host, but when beetle populations get fairly high, eastern white pine can get attacked and beetles can emerge out of those trees.
What about some of these pine species you're seeing up in the northeast as SPB moves northward?
Good question. Good question. They're in pitch pine in the northeast and are doing fairly well in pitch pine as well.
Okay. A few questions about ips and drought, and I think you kind of covered why ips generally attract drought trees. It's just a stress factor, but do we have any idea how much drought stress makes a tree susceptible to ips beetles?
I do not know the answer to that, and actually I was talking with a colleague about that particular topic the other day. I think that there needs to be more work there about how much drought stress makes a tree susceptible. I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure anybody does.
Yep. And that was one thing. That's probably the main reason ips are so bad in Georgia is we have drought stress everywhere at this point. Can you talk a little bit about the range in size of ip spots? Like how big can they be? How big are they usually?
Well, generally ips don't kill trees in spots like southern pine beetle do. They're generally just that scattered pattern through a stand. However, like you're seeing in Georgia right now with the four-spined ips creating these large areas, the largest I've ever heard of is like a 60-acre spot, and that always is kind of shocking to even forest entomology people that have been around quite a long time. So, you know, when you're talking about a 40-acre ip spot, that's fairly dramatic and unusual.
Yeah, and a question just came in, somewhat related. When does a forest recover from drought? And I don't think there's an easy answer, so I'll turn that one over to you.
Great, thanks. I don't know the answer, but hopefully there's a fairly fast response to trees that have a well-developed root system. Depends on where the tree is on the landscape too, but generally there is a little bit of a delay there. Oftentimes, particularly with like oak trees, you have a drought and then you get some rain, you know, and you think, well, why are my oak trees dying? We have plenty of rain. There's still kind of there's that delayed response. There was probably some root damage and. Depending on where the tree is on the landscape, is it close to water, is it up on the hill, those kind of things. But there is a delay in responding even after you start to get more rain.
Right. Okay, John, why are the national forests seeing more and larger attacks than private or industry lands? That
is a great question. It is true that the past several outbreaks in the South have really been, with dealing with southern pine beetle, we're really talking about have been contained on the national forest. Why that is, I think it has one part of that is the management difference between the national forest versus the private adjacent land. Another difference may be, and I don't have any data on this at all, just me talking, maybe there's a difference in the genetics for private land versus on what's on the national forest land. But I think most of it is in relation to the management style between private versus federal and the age of the stands. Although most of the southern pine beetle, really like on the national forest in Mississippi right now, is occurring in the stands younger than 45 years of age.
All right, John, does cut and leave change your view on thinning during an outbreak in areas where commercial thinning is not available?
I guess I don't understand the question.
I'm not sure either. Whoever put that in, could you elaborate a little bit for me? That'd be great. Let's move on here. Is there a time during the year that thinning can increase susceptibility to beetle attack from SPB or IPS?
With IPS, I don't know that I would thin during an active outbreak, or I don't know that you want to have the least amount of stress on your trees as you can. So whatever local conditions are there for both SPB and for IPS, I think that there are some differences probably as to when you should thin versus not thin. But that's kind of a local decision there, and just try to be as nice to your trees as you can when you're doing your thinning operation, especially if you have active southern pine beetle or IPS out there in your area.
And then here's a question when we were talking about the prescribed fire stuff. Do you know what the fire intensities were in those studies, or was it just sort of low, slow burn type things?
I don't have the papers in front of me, but at least with like the Brian Sullivan paper, are we talking about the Sullivan paper with bark beetles, or are we talking about the paper that I was associated with? The paper I was associated with, I do not know. I think with the Brian Sullivan paper, they did have some measure of the intensity of fire in those studies. But with like the paper I was talking about for the part I was involved in, those are just the National Forest folks did their normal prescribed fire. It wasn't a set-up study. It was just what had been done in the past.
Got it. Do we see a lot of bark beetle mortality from winter freeze?
We can. Bark beetles do die if it gets fairly cold. I don't remember the number right offhand, but I think it's around -7 or -10 degrees for a sustained period of time. You can get some winter-related mortality in that case, but the temperature has to get fairly low because the bark beetles are underneath that bark, which is an insulating factor, so temperatures have to get pretty low.
All right, getting back to that felon leaf thing. Felon leaf increases the debris on the forest floor with tops, branches, etc., and may slow pheromone dispersal. Your thoughts as to this significance?
Well, one part of the felon leaf is that you're cutting the trees down, and we usually recommend that in the south during the summer. So you're dropping the trees on the ground. Hopefully some of the beetles are getting baked in there and don't emerge at all. And then when the beetles do come out, if they do come out, they're not going to the debris. They would be going to adjacent trees, but they're probably coming out at various times, and the pheromone communication between adjacent trees is probably broken up quite a bit because your emergence is going to be a lot more disjunct than it would be if you had left those trees standing and you had a bunch of brood all emerging at one time.
All right, we'll take our last question here, then I'll give everyone their link for their CEUs. Does the susceptibility of shortleaf have a relationship to its occurrence on old abandoned ag lands? And would this susceptibility be different if those trees were on sites that were not former ag land?
That's a great question. I think that shortleaf and loblolly are fairly similar in their resin capability. A thinned, again though, that's more thinking about the individual tree vigor. I think that if you properly manage your shortleaf pine stand and you're thinning it, I think that stand is much less susceptible than a stand that's unthinned. I think no matter what site you're growing on, we've looked at shortleaf pine stands all across the South, even in areas where shortleaf is the preferred tree for that particular site.
All right, and with that, I think we're gonna stop here.